So what I'm reporting on today is work in progress for a stylometric dating study of Pindar's Odes. The aim of which is to use features collected from the Odes which have securely dated, securely known dates, the training data, to discover features in them which will help to classify into fairly broadly defined periods the Odes whose dates are not securely known. The data I'm counting are random substrings between 1 and 8 characters long, collected throughout the Odes by a program that I wrote for the task. The text I'm using is the electronic text from the TLG. It seems that many of the data mining projects in humanities are looking for similarities or parallels between different texts. My project is to take 2 textual corpora and to ask which substrings are best able to distinguish these periods from each other. What are the greatest differences that we could use to tell one from the other? In this case, based on the relative frequencies of these substrings that I'm finding in the different corpora. The substrings found will then be considered markers for their respective corpora and can aid in classifying unknown texts into one or the other. Using stylistic evidence from securely dated Odes and using it to date the undated Odes is not something new. We have strong external evidence for the dates of the Olympian and Pythian Odes. These come down to us in the Scholia to Pindar. The less important Nemean and Isthmian Odes, however, they don't come down to those dates. So in those cases, we have to rely on internal evidence inside the Odes, which have some of the evidence is pretty useful. Others, there's a lot of debate. So this has led to a long tradition of scholarship, which has attempted to date the undated Odes based on similarities found to the dated Odes. About 50 years ago, almost exactly, last month, Hans Polsheimer wrote an article looking at these types of studies, which found parallels between the Odes. And really, he found this type of argument very lacking. There were any similarities you can find between some Odes, you can almost always find the same similarities with Odes from a completely different period. So it's been that article he wrote almost 50 years ago put a big damper on dating studies of this kind. Nevertheless, this is, I'm trying to resurrect this method of argument. However, the things that I'm counting, the features that I'm using to make these comparisons are quite different, as I hope to show. And more importantly, since the feature counting is being carried out by a computer program across the entire corpus of dated Odes, and because these counts are ranked statistically based on their ability to distinguish the periods as they are defined, the troubles which previous studies have faced shouldn't apply. There are other difficulties which I will get into below them. But first, let me say why Pindar's Odes are especially good candidates for stylometric analysis. First, the specificity and relative certainty of the dates for many of his Odes. The Olympian and Pythian Odes, as I said, come down to us with dates from the tradition of Scholia. And if they are to be believed, and there seems to be a good amount of certainty that these are fairly good dates, it gives us great external evidence that we can use. So we've got sort of markers. We've got places that we can fix the debate. A lot of work has been done trying to date Plato's dialogues. The trouble there is we just don't have any fixed points that we can start from. We've got tons and tons of data, but there's nowhere to start really. That's the great thing about Pindar. We have a place to start where we can clearly identify features from the respective periods. Furthermore, the odes are occasional. They're written for momentary celebrations. It is unlikely that they received extensive editing after their initial performance. Plato, on the other hand, there is a lot of speculation that his dialogues were edited over the course of his entire life. Each ode is a snapshot of Pindar's style, as it was in the period that the ode was written. Second, the length of Pindar's career from Pythian 10, which we know or strongly believed to have been written in 498 BC, to Pythian 8 in 446, we have Pindar has a career of at least 52 years. This gives a long period over which his style could change. It would be quite remarkable if there weren't any stylistic evolutions taking place over that period. And we have dated odes spread fairly evenly throughout those 52 years. Third, the homogeneity of the odes as a genre. Pindar's odes were written in a fairly consistent Doric dialect. This stability gives a neutral backdrop against which it is hoped the stylistic features will stand out. Furthermore, the subject matter is uniform across the entire corpus. This uniformity should mean that unconscious features, unconscious stylistic features of this may be easier to come out. The unconscious features seem to be more useful in this type of study, it's been found. I'm basing, the technique I'm using for this study, I'm basing on two papers by Richard Forsyth. Forsyth and Holmes, in their 1996 article, tested 5 different methods for text classification in the realm of dating. And they were comparing them one to the other with mostly on known data so that they could find what's the best method if you want to figure out a chronology of text. And they tested these 5 different techniques on 10 different text classification problems. They found one that they had developed themselves called the Monte Carlo feature finder to be the most effective. And this is what I'm trying to use in this study. In the next article, whereas I wrote, he took the Monte Carlo feature finder and he tested it on the poems of Yeats. The dates of Yeats' poems are pretty well known, so it was a very good place where he could test the usefulness of this method. In his study, he was correctly able to categorize 9 of 10 of Yeats' poems, which he had excluded from his initial training data. Furthermore, and rather remarkably, 2 poems which Yeats had written as a young poet and later revised later in his career were correctly categorized, the early versions and early, the late versions and the late. So it's, at least in this study that Forsyth did, has been found a pretty useful technique. So I modeled my technique on these studies. So the dated odes were divided into early and late periods. This is the training data. This is what I'm trying to learn the stylistic features from. And how I divide the periods, this is where probably the most problematic part, which I'm still working on. In the beginning, I was trying to find periods that where I could have a fairly even number of amount of data between the early and late periods. Probably I'm going to have to revise that though. Next, I was using the TLG text, so I stripped out the unnecessary data code, just leaving the Greek characters, breathing marks, iota subscripts, and spaces to no word breaks. Now the texts are compared, a calculation of how many possible substrings could be counted in this data. So between 1 and 8 characters, multiply that by the length in characters, it's 8 times the length. And then I took a percentage of that, the total number of substrings that could be counted. Using percentages rather than, even if they were perfectly equal in length, these 2 periods, the early odes and the late odes, it's useful to use percentages of the possible countable substrings because then you can randomize where you're counting. Having an amount of randomness can even out some of the what could otherwise be problems. So I've been working with 80% of the possible substrings that could be counted. counted. So next, the substrings are counted, varying in length between 1 and 8 characters, chosen from random locations within the Odes. And to these frequency counts, I applied the chi-square test. Chi-square is a statistical distribution used for hypothesis testing, among other purposes. For this study, the hypothesis is that particular substrings will occur in the different periods of Pindar's poetry equally. So this is the null hypothesis, that you have a substring that will occur in either period equally. By using the chi-square function on the substring frequencies, it gives a measure of how far they stray from that hypothesis. So by putting, so once the chi-square score is calculated for the substrings, to the result of training data, then we can put these substrings that were counted in order. So we've got the substrings still in beta code here. And the counts, these are absolute counts, early and late. Remember times sigma state kappa alpha was found in early Odes was once, and the late Odes was 11. The chi-squared score is in this column, which is calculated from these two numbers. And if we put this in order, with the highest at the top, that sigma space kappa was found to be the most useful substring in distinguishing the early Odes from the late Odes. What does sigma space kappa mean in context? What does it mean for literary purposes is another question, a very important question. But just looking at the numbers, this is what has arisen. The final step, once I have, this is the training data. Once the training data is calculated, the final step is to take this and apply it to the Odes of unknown date. And simply go through, and you've got to cut this off at a certain point. How many of these are significant? Part of that is determined just by the higher the chi-square score, the higher the p-value is, which at a certain point is not statistically useful. But in any case, you have to cut it off at a certain point. But you go through and you count how many of these substrings are found in the undated Odes. And you get a table that looks like this. So Pythian 10 had 62 early markers, 20 late markers. So it's probably an early Ode. So that is how it's supposed to work. In this table, these are actually known Odes. These are Odes with known dates. I'll explain that in a second. So that's the method. On to the results. How well are these able to classify? And it turns out not very well. It works very well for Forsyth and DCA study. So far, I've got some work to do. So what this table is, were I to apply this to the unknown Odes, it would be a similar table with isthmian and anemian Odes listed. For this, I withheld, in each case, I withheld an Ode with a known date from the training data, and tried to see whether I could predict which period it would be in based on the accounts. In black, these were successful classifications. In red, these were unsuccessful classifications. And it's way too much red to have any confidence in the idea that this is working yet. But this is how it will, eventually this is what will be the result table. Isthmian and anemian Odes, and ideally it will be correctly categorized. But before I'll even run that test, I want to be sure I can correctly categorize those with known dates. So it seems that a lot of the next steps are going to hinge on determining what is an early Ode and what is a late Ode in the training data. That is one of the goals Forsyth had in his study, was to remove the amount of human judgment involved in this process. He didn't want the person doing the study to be able to choose which features are useful. If the computer can tell us what the data, if the computer can show us what the data is already contained in the data, if that's superior to a human adding in ideas from elsewhere. But a decision still has to be made in creating the training data. The decision has to be made. Where do we draw the line between the early and the late Odes? Where are we going to get these features? And is this feature early or late? With Forsyth's Yates study, we had a fairly convenient break, World War I, where even Yates alluded to the idea that maybe his style had changed. So it was a convenient break to divide Yates' career. With Pindar, I haven't found anything nearly so convenient. And I think where I'm going to go now is to try to let the data tell me what to do, again, in this case, in the division of the early and late periods. We have the dates, but is 468 early? Is it late? Is it in the middle? There could be more than 2 periods. So the next step is going to be to, and when you run the training data, I'm only getting about 100,000 or so unique substrings between 1 and 8 characters long. That's not, for a computer, that's not a whole lot. So I think the next step is going to be, for each of those distinct substrings found, is to run it through a bunch of different tests, seeing, well, if we put the threshold between early and late here, if we did it here, and seeing whichever one of these possibilities comes up with the highest chi-square score is probably going to be an indication that that's where a change was made in regards to how that substring affected or was affected by Pindar's style. And I'm hoping that by combining that information from all the different substrings, a more natural period, a more natural break in where his style might have changed is going to arise. So that's the next step. Of course, even with that, another thing that I'm fighting is that his style can be evolving in one direction at a certain point, but at another point it could be diverging in another direction. That could be a pretty significant complication, but it's something that's pretty easily believable. It's certainly possible that in some respects Pindar's style started changing in one direction at a certain point, but it started changing in another direction, even while the one arc was still going. But those are the next steps. And the other thing is how many substrings to consider significant. If I go back to this, the sigma space kappa is much higher a determiner of period than x, which is almost always a preposition or a prefix. But as it is, and as Forsyth conducted his study, they're given equal weight as markers. X as a late marker, and sigma space kappa is also a late marker. But maybe they shouldn't be given equal weight. So those two things are kind of the next things I'm going to look at. I've got a couple more things to show before I conclude. So these are, sorry. Okay, I'll wrap up very quickly then. So this is sigma space kappa. These are on the x-axis. These are the Odes with no dates in chronological order, and we can see a cluster coming up toward the beginning middle. And here we can look at the substrings in context. You can see often it's sigma at the end of the word, chi at the is the next word. You see, dative plurals were found to be a very early marker, or a very strong early marker. The single character, C, was a fairly good late marker. Eos, the ending, was clustered very strongly in the early late period. And I guess I'll conclude there.